Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Ron Halber, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. The JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in our nation's capital, the third largest in the United States. We represent more than 100 organizations and synagogues throughout the region. The JCRC is a strong supporter of the State of Israel, and we work hard every day to advocate for a strong, safe, and democratic Israel. We support Israel's right to defend itself and its people against terrorism and any other security threat. I'd like to thank the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington for participating with us on this webinar today. Over 1,100 people have registered to participate in this webinar from around the world, and we thank you for joining us. I'd also like to thank Alexis Schwartz and Adam Odesser, JCRC's Israel Action Center Director and Associate, respectively, for arranging this webinar. Over the last few days, more than 1,500 rockets, and that number is now higher, have been indiscriminately fired from Gaza into Israel by Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists, killing Israelis and forcing millions of Israelis to flee to bomb shelters out of fear for their lives. To share his experience and analysis of the current situation in Israel, it is our honor and privilege, as it has been in the past, to host and welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross. Ambassador Ross is counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Prior to returning to the Institute in 2011, he served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director of the Central Region, and a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross has played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process and in dealing directly with the parties in the negotiation. We will begin today's webinar with a 15-minute overview of the situation in Israel. Then we will open for questions, where I'll ask for a couple of questions we've prepared in advance and for those that have been submitted in advance by our audience. And at any point, if somebody would like to ask a question, and we'll try in our limited time to ask as many as we can, please use the Q&A feature and send them to us. Ambassador, as always, thank you for being here, and I pass it over to you for your remarks.
Okay, thanks very much. Always good to be with you, Ron. So, look, this is a very difficult time. Let me give you a bit of context so it will provide a basis, I think, for our discussion. The run-up to what we've seen now, I think, embodies what I can only describe as a perfect storm of a set of circumstances. You had Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, cancel the elections that he had called for. Why is this a factor? Because these elections were clearly something that the Palestinian public wanted to take part in. 93% of those who were eligible registered to vote in them. There hadn't been an election since 2007. There clearly is a lot of alienation from the Palestinian Authority. There was a desire to have some form of expression. And so the canceling of the election and then using Israel as a pretext, meaning that Israel wouldn't allow the Palestinians to vote in East Jerusalem. This was clearly a pretext. It was seen through by Palestinians, and Hamas saw this as an opportunity. It looked at it as an opening to begin to undercut Abbas to gain an advantage. Now, against the backdrop of this, there's several other things taking place. This is in the period of Ramadan. Ramadan is always, because it's a period of reflection, it's always a period of more acute religious identity and prayer. You had at one point younger Palestinians being denied sitting outside the Damascus gate when they would go in and out of the old city. That's usually a congregating point. The Israeli police, for some reason, decided to deny it. That space, that produced clashes. The Shin Bet then said, take down the barriers. It was done. In addition to this, in the last days of the Ramadan, which it becomes a period when thousands go to Jerusalem to pray, this was also coinciding with Jerusalem Day, which is a day that Israelis commemorate the victory of 1967 and basically the reunification of Jerusalem. Thousands of Jews go to the Wailing Wall, go to the Kotel. On one of these mornings, whether because there were stones being thrown over the side into the Kotel from the platform where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, the Israeli police at a certain point ended up shooting tear gas into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Anytime you touch, not just Jerusalem, but specifically the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, anytime you touch that, this has a kind of an electric effect, not only among Palestinians, but even outside Palestinians and with Muslims throughout most of the Middle East. And so you take each of these things, the cancellation of the election, the Jerusalem Day, you add to it what had been another clear irritant that was being seized upon by Hamas and others, which was Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is this area, it's a neighborhood very close to the old city, just outside the walls, largely Arab. There are Palestinian families there who have lived there since after the 1948 war. They went in as refugees, and between the UN and the Jordanians, they basically built these, they put them in these houses. These were in areas that were owned by Jews who had been forced to flee East Jerusalem in the 1948 war. After 67, these areas were bought by a Jewish trust. In the last few years, you had right-wing settler movements bought up the area from the Jewish trust. And the Palestinians, these 70 people in 4 houses who have lived there with their families basically since 1948, were supposed to be evicted. The lower level courts found that they should be evicted based on the law. As the Supreme Court basically was supposed to hear it on this Monday. Here again, the Israeli Attorney General made the decision to request the Supreme Court delay any such decision, because this again had become kind of a focal point for clashes. So you take the totality of everything I've identified, all of which is in Jerusalem, all of which is taking place during Ramadan, and Hamas saw a moment that it could capitalize on to try to seize the mantle of Palestinian leadership, to portray itself as if it was the one defending Palestinians against Israeli encroachments in Jerusalem, and to use this as a device to compete with Fatah and with the Palestinian Authority. And what they did on Monday was fire 7 rockets at Jerusalem. And for the Israeli government, this would have been true across the spectrum. This was not just this particular government. It was a reality where a threshold was being crossed, where Hamas was acting as if it could dictate to Israel how it would behave. You actually had Mohammed Deif, the major bomb maker from the 1990s and from the Second Intifada, come out publicly. Normally he lives in the shadows, you don't see him, came out publicly and threatened, unless the Israelis withdrew their police from the areas in East Jerusalem, that in fact Hamas would launch rockets. And they did, and the Israeli response was to say, well, obviously we've lost our deterrent, so we have to reimpose deterrence. And what we've seen are a couple of things that are pretty striking. Ron said something like 1,500 rockets. I think we're at 1,800 rockets now that have been fired into Israel. There was a barrage again into not just the south, but into central Israel. Ben Gurion has been closed. And Israel has hit Gaza very hard. The aim in hitting Gaza very hard is to try to convince Hamas's leaders the price they're going to pay for what they've done isn't worth it. And this is the kind of thing that they can't even think about doing again in the future. The price that's being imposed so far by the Israelis, they have succeeded in killing a significant number of Hamas commanders. In addition to the Hamas commanders that they've succeeded in killing, they also have killed the head of R&D for Hamas, who helps develops the rockets, the guy who runs the rocket production, the commander of Gaza City. So they have killed a number of very prominent Hamas commanders. Is that enough at this point? I think the critical question for Israel is going to be, how do you define what's enough for deterrence? Israel is certainly sending a signal that they may be prepared, especially given the barrages that continue, to send ground forces into Gaza. I don't think Hamas wants that, but I also think they doubt that this is real. They suspect, I think, that it's more bluff than real, because the truth is, the last thing Israel really wants to do is to send forces in on the ground. Gaza is teeming. It is not a place where you want to be fighting. The nature of the urban warfare there works completely against any kind of a conventional force. It creates areas that are pretty much killing zones for those who are going into them. So it's not at all clear that the Israelis want to do that. But if in fact the Hamas succeeds in shutting down Tel Aviv, shutting down Ben Gurion, shutting down the economy, you may well see Israel driven to that. Hamas is indicating to the Egyptians that they're open to a ceasefire. That also suggests that they think they've gained enough at this point, or at least that the losses are manageable. I think we have a mismatch right now between where the Israelis are in terms of feeling what they need to have to reestablish deterrence, and where Hamas is in terms of wanting to be able to proclaim victory. They will proclaim victory regardless of the outcome. But the reality is, when everyone has to look at what's been done to Gaza and you take into account what Hamas has once again done, what we see is Hamas basically uses its public as a kind of human shield. You know, their commanders, the most senior leadership, their command control, where do they go? They'll go into the basement of Sheba Hospital, or they'll go into a mosque. They position themselves in highly dense popular areas that are entirely civilian. They try to make this very difficult for the Israelis to be able to carry out attacks against them. They, in a sense, create these human shields. What they do pretty much penalizes their own public, but that's basically who Hamas is. And I just might say, when they fired the 7 rockets at Jerusalem, East Jerusalem has a population of 368,000 Palestinians. So if you fire rockets at Jerusalem and you hit the populated area, you have just as much of a chance of killing Palestinians as anyone else. That obviously doesn't enter on the Hamas agenda. So that's basically where we are on the outside. Now, there's a couple other points I want to make before I turn it over to your questions. We are seeing something within Israel that we really haven't seen. Even at the beginning of the Second Intifada, when there were riots and demonstrations in a number of mixed Arab Jewish towns in the northern part of Israel. We're seeing this all over Israel. In central Israel, in Lod, there was an emergency that was, the state of emergency that was declared. In the north, in the Galilee area, in Acre, in parts of Haifa, we are seeing what have been mobs of Arabs and Jews basically doing unspeakable things to different communities. We're seeing now the Israeli leadership come out and emphasize this is unacceptable, it's intolerable, and there has to be leadership within the Israeli Arab community to emphasize how wrong this is. There has to be leadership on the Israeli side, which we are seeing more now than we were before. But you had younger Israeli Arabs who were going through and trashing Jewish places, establishments, synagogues, and the like, in effect carrying out pogroms. And then you had far-right ultranationalists, one group called Lahava, going through and basically committing lynchings of Israeli Arabs. In one case, they seriously beat someone they thought was an Arab who was not, and he's in serious condition in the hospital now. So this has to be brought back under control. There's been 4 nights now, including tonight, where there still are disturbances. This is something we really haven't seen at any point. You have to go back in some ways, not to the Second Intifada, but you almost have to go back to the pre-state period of 1936 to 39 to see something that even looks like an approximation of what we're seeing right now. This is not the Israel that we have known. Where are we? What can be done to bring both the fighting between Hamas and Israel to an end? I said Hamas is already indicating some interest in a ceasefire, but I suspect right now that's more for posturing. I think also the Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying they're not close to being done yet on the Israeli side. That may also be for posturing at this point. The longer barrages go on, the longer as I said, Ben Gurion is closed down, the greater the pressure there will be for Israel to have to go in on the ground, and that's not really an option that I think anyone wants to exercise. What I think we can do, and let me sort of wrap it up with this, I think the administration, which has been pretty active now at the Secretary of State level and the National Security Advisor level, even President Biden has now made a couple of calls both to Netanyahu and to Abu Mazen. But I think the real focus probably has to be on Egypt, because Egypt has brokered the last 4 ceasefires, the last 4 conflicts dating from 2012. Every single one of those has been brokered by Egypt. The Biden administration doesn't have the closest relationship with Egypt. Egypt has its own interest to try to exercise its leverage, which it has because it controls the border with Gaza. It has some interest in doing it regardless to try to calm things down. But I think it also has an interest in trying to show the Biden administration that we have an interest in Egypt and in a way that gives Egypt even more of an incentive to show how helpful it can be on dealing on issues that also matter to us. Foreign policy is always involving a kind of choice that has to be made where you balance interests and values. The concerns for human rights is a real factor for this administration, but also looking at a conflict like this, which is killing way too many people, that also has to be a concern. And so here I think the administration does need to be working closely with the Egyptians because they're the ones who are most capable of bringing this to a ceasefire. Last observation, so you get the ceasefire, we also have to have a different approach that doesn't just repeat this in another 6, 12, or 18 months. And I can get into an idea I have for what might be done with regard to that, but why don't we turn it over to your questions?
Ambassador, once again, thank you very much for that analysis. During your talk, you mentioned about the differing definitions of deterrence, and that Hamas needs to feel that they've proclaimed a victory, albeit you already noted that they're going to declare a victory regardless, and the Israelis need to feel that they have a true victory to deter them from doing this again. Yet this has happened 4 times already, and they keep firing. So are parties really is this really a deterrence, or is this just a temporary deterrence until the next round? So what does a true deterrence look like?
Well, I'll give you an example of something that has proved to be a deterrent. In 2006, Israel and Hezbollah fought a war. Hezbollah claimed a great victory in the aftermath of that, and there hasn't been a war since then.
Right.
There's a kind of mutual deterrence. Israel really doesn't want to go in, but Hezbollah doesn't want to trigger an Israeli attack either by what they do.
Nasrallah acknowledged that, if I remember, himself.
Well, he actually said, if he had known what the Israelis were going to do, they wouldn't have done what they did. So there is a kind of, the point is, there has to be a high enough price that is exacted. Now, the problem here with Hamas is it's hard to know just what that price is. And obviously, Ron, as you pointed out, so far, the price hasn't been an enduring one, because we've had 4 different rounds. They've been on the order of more like 18 to 24 months. So you could say you're buying time. So long as Hamas is there, it's hard to buy more than that. Now, I'll use this as a reason to explain the idea I have in mind.
Please do.
Hamas wants to seize the mantle of the Palestinian movement, wants to claim it's the only one who stands up for Palestinians. But if what it presides over is a complete disaster in terms of complete impoverishment, it's hardly a compelling case to be made. By the way, if there was a real free and fair vote in Gaza, Hamas would lose in Gaza because they're not popular there, because life is very hard.
But they might win in the terror. They might win in the West Bank
because the PA is seen as so corrupt that there's such alienation. What you see is the leaderships in both places have alienated their publics. But my point here is Hamas is not indifferent to what the mood of the public is, because it exacts a price on them through coercion to stay in power. So the thought I have is the following. I would like to see the Biden administration organize internationally what would be a Marshall Plan for Gaza, but it would be conditioned on no Hamas rockets that would have to be verified on the ground. No laboratories for building them, no smuggling in. There has to be, again, there has to be enough transparency to be able to see this. There's a logic for this in two ways. First, it will certainly appeal to the 2 million Gazans who are there. And you showcase it, you highlight it, you make clear this is possible, but no Hamas rockets. And for a very simple reason, no one is going to invest big time in building up Gaza if Hamas in 12 months or 18 months decides they're going to start something again. Israel then responds by basically destroying everything that's just been built. So you can make the case, but you have to do it repeatedly in a public way. You have to shine a spotlight on Hamas, put them on the defensive. This is one way, I think, also to affect their behavior. The point is, it isn't, whatever Israel does militarily is not going to be enough. We've already seen that.
Right.
The last, you had in 2014, you had a conflict that went on for 52 days. You had at least 3,000 Palestinians who were killed. You had more than a larger number than that of buildings that were destroyed. So, that bought you some time, but not a hell of a lot of time. So it's not just what you impose militarily. And the problem is, one of the things that the Israelis have not done in the past is they've never sought to, while they've sought to go after commanders of Hamas, they haven't sought to decapitate Hamas. Why? Because they still want an address. They want to be able to hold somebody responsible. So this is obviously it's a terrible dilemma. And trying to strike just the right balance is hard to find. But that's why I say it can't only be a military approach. And that's why I'm suggesting, what can you do that would also expose Hamas and put them on the defensive?
Mm-hmm. So you spoke for a while about, when you turned to domestic Israel, about how it's really been unprecedented since the days of the Yeshuv, pre-state days of Israel, where there's been places that have had decent, traditionally, coexistence between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, literally burning in flames, facilities, mob scenes on both sides, violence on both sides. Can you talk a little bit about how does Israel rebuild that coexistence? Is it possible? How does Israel's internal social fabric get reconstituted after when this conflict comes to an end at some point?
It will come to an end. Look, I think one of the things that has to happen is there has to be a very different approach with the leadership of the Israeli Arabs. And it may not just be the political parties, it may also be the mayors, the local leaders. There has to be serious outreach. I think there's a paradox here, because there were two emergent realities that were sending exactly the opposite signal of what we're seeing. At the height of COVID, when you have 20% of all the Israeli doctors are Israeli Arabs, when 30% of all the pharmacists are Israeli Arabs, the perception in the body politic was the people on the front lines were overwhelmingly Arab, and they were exposing themselves and putting themselves at risk. That changed the image of Israeli Arabs within the country. Then you had Bibi reaching out as he was trying to put together a government with Mansour Abbas, who, by the way, his own public statements and responses have actually been good. He's been saying we have to calm down, we have to be talking to each other. But he's also said he suspended any government formation, and now Bennett has said this is not the time for a change, and he's ready to negotiate with Netanyahu. I'm not sure that really changes anything, because that still doesn't produce enough votes. It probably produces a fifth election. But I think the point here is there's going to have to be a very different kind of dialogue. There's going to have to be a very different kind of outreach. There's going to have to be much more attention given to the needs of the Israeli Arabs. One of the reasons that Mansour Abbas emerged as having an appeal is because he was saying, look, I'm prepared to deal with Netanyahu or anyone else because I'm focused on the fact that we need investment in our infrastructure, which has been consistently neglected. We need law and order, and the Israeli police don't pay attention to us. We need, in a sense, what citizens get. So you had these two realities that suggested something very different. You look at polling over the last couple of years, and you'll find around 70% of all Israeli Arabs will say they're happy to be Israelis. Now, there's a younger contingent, a younger constituency that are much more radicalized, and they've been the ones on the street. Maybe they represent 10% of the population, but if you're 1.2 million Israeli Arabs, well, 10% is 120,000. So, and they don't all have to be out in the street, but that produces numbers. They have to be delegitimized. Now that has to come from the Israeli Arabs, but they're not the only ones who have to be delegitimized. These ultranationalist thugs, Lahava, who went looking, came into places like Lod and Bat Yam. They came in from the outside. The Jewish mayor there talked about it was these guys, these outsiders who came in. They have to be delegitimized. They have to be prosecuted. There has to be a price. So this has to be a conscious effort. The truth is, this is much more of, it's an order of magnitude different order of threat to Israel than what Hamas represents. And so it has to be, this is going to have to be dealt with in a very deliberate way. And there's going to have to be signs of political leadership. Should be less focus on the election per se, or at least make this one of the issues in the election. Who is going to commit themselves to repairing the fissures within Israel in a way that we haven't seen?
Do you think that do you think there's enough goodwill for these social fissures to be overcome and to be rebuilt? I mean, is this do you think the leadership is there to make it happen?
I don't know. I mean, anybody who says they know, at this point, nobody knows. What I'm sure is, in the immediate aftermath of this, this is going to be very difficult. But the first requirement, the first precondition, is recognizing how serious a threat this represents to the state.
Right.
And it has to be dealt with on a priority basis. If it is, look, one thing about Israel, every time Israel has faced something that everyone could see was a national priority, it dealt with it. And so I have some faith that this is possible this time. But look, we haven't seen political leadership in Israel for the last 2 years. We've just seen a kind of constant competition with elections.
Here's a question that was very interesting is, can the new relationships built with came from a member of our audience, can the new relationships being built, well, actually that have been built and via the Abrahamic Accords be leveraged to help stabilize the current situation?
I think you're going to find that it's not so simple. The UAE hosted an Arab League meeting where it was very blunt in its condemnation of what Israel was doing in Jerusalem. Now, that doesn't mean the UAE is going to walk away from the peace treaty. They won't, because they genuinely want the benefits of this, not in the security areas, although they want that too. But, they obviously staked out this position because they felt whenever you touch Jerusalem, it puts everybody who has a relationship with Israel in the Arab world on the defensive. So they rekindle their sense of Arab identity and the like. Having said that, can they play a role over time? Yes. If you're talking about doing something in the near term, unlikely. But look, my view has been the Abraham Accords, if you build on them, and I don't mean by saying we want to build them, I mean by actively brokering additional understandings between Arab states that do outreach towards Israel, and that Israel, in response to the outreach, you work out a kind of menu of steps that, as an example, the Saudis would take towards Israel with the understanding of certain steps the Israelis would take towards the Palestinians, which we would then broker what the Palestinians would have to do in response, because they don't just get to receive, they have to give too. That could allow you to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. What this whole set of events has reminded us of is that the Abraham Accords are not a substitute for dealing with the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian issue didn't just go away, and it reminds me of not long after the Abraham Accords, a very senior Emirati official said to me, "Look, Dennis, we don't have a Palestinian problem. The Israelis have a Palestinian problem."
Yeah, I remember the feeling after the Abrahamic Accords that a lot of people were talking about how a new era, and it is a new era in some ways that they've enlarged the circle. But again, I think you're right when you talk about the fact is the Palestinian problem is not going away. I mean, no matter how many peace treaties Israel signs, and hopefully there'll be more, this is going to go on. That's an issue that has to be resolved. One person wrote in, how is Hamas actually able to get their hands on all of these weapons when Israel has a naval and aerial blockade of Gaza?
Well, because in fact, you still have different levels of smuggling that takes place. Oftentimes weapons are smuggled in based on disassembled parts, but also it's not just that. They have built production labs. They're producing these from within. Although the drones, they've been flying drones that are Iranian drones. So, you know, what the Israelis have succeeded in right so far in killing the head of the Hamas official in charge of R&D for their weapons development. They were able to kill the head of their rocket production forces. So they are they obviously knew where these people were, and they're killing key commanders, but they're also killing the key, in many ways, the key nodes, the key people responsible for the production cycle of these weapons. But, you know, the Hamas obviously used the ceasefires to build themselves up. And it's one of the consequences. That's why I'm saying there needs to be an understanding, and it needs to be seen, and we should be mobilizing this. If there's if there's suffering within Gaza and you want to see massive reconstruction, no, you can't do it so long as Hamas basically is committed to developing its weapons capabilities, because you're just living on borrowed time.
You've been a part of negotiating Middle East deals and flying back and forth to the Middle East for 4 decades, 5 decades.
Not 5. I wasn't.
Not
that
5. You're not that old. You're not that old.
I wasn't doing it as a
20-year-old
in grammar school.
In a grammar school. I thought with your record, actually, you might have been. So I have a question for you. As someone who's been actually, on the ground and doing these negotiations and been involved in these negotiations, what's going on right now in the minds of American diplomats who are over there trying to go ahead and who are trying to work with the Egyptians to make this? Are they thinking this thing is going to play itself out, and that is really Israeli deterrence, when that is reached, is going to be the true end? Or is the administration? And so, what do you think then in this? And also, so I guess the broader question is, if you were there right now and you were the one negotiating this conflict and trying to settle this right now, and you know that it's also based on deterrence, what is really the ability of the American government to work with the Egyptians to affect a positive outcome?
Well, the way I would do it would be the following. The first thing I'd do is I'd be sitting with the Israelis and say to them, tell me what you think you have to have. What has to happen to convince Hamas that the price is too high? Don't give me slogans. Tell me what practically you see yourselves having to do. And by the way, you have to have that discussion, because I'm not sure the Israelis have an answer right now. It's easy to say we have to reestablish deterrence. Saying it and achieving it and having a definition of what it takes, the level of the price you have to impose on Hamas, that should be a serious discussion between us and them, so that we know what we should be keeping in mind.
Well, previous levels of definition haven't worked, because they keep flaring up again. So deterrence, if you want, is deterrence an 18-month thing or a 10-year thing? That's also part of the.
Well, it could be. Yeah, you have to ask, how much time are you trying to buy? Because so long as Hamas is there, that's what you're in the business of doing. And you're trying to maximize the time, much like it was done with Hezbollah. But there has to be a serious discussion where you walk through, okay, what do you think you have to do? What's the level? What is the price that matters most to the Hamas leadership that will, in fact, clearly create a profound hesitancy on their part to invite anything like this again? But that requires a serious discussion. You do that before you talk to the Egyptians. Then you talk to the Egyptians and you sort of say, look, this isn't going to stop until we see the following. Okay? And we want you to try to we want you to play this mediating role. But one of the things you ought to be telling Hamas is they probably need you to come in and save them. Your approach with Hamas is to basically say, you know what, at this point, we're not so keen to save you. This is what we're going to require from you. And once you get that going, then you're in a position to, I think, create an outcome that is more likely to be sustainable for a longer period. But as I said, first you get the ceasefire. And whatever I said it earlier, Hamas will claim victory regardless of what the outcome is. When everybody's looking at the level of destruction and the level of impoverishment in Gaza, it'll look again like a really a Pyrrhic victory, certainly to those who live in Gaza. By the way, a third of their rockets, they're firing many more than are actually hitting Israel. A third of them are hitting in Gaza, including they knocked out their own power plant with one of their rockets. So again, Egypt can say, you want us to get this stuff? You want us to rescue you? This is what we require from you. These are what the terms are going to be. And then in the aftermath of that, then there has to be a larger political strategy of what I was describing.
Somebody asked, it could be that Bibi wants to continue punishing Hamas so that he could stay in power, and for political reasons?
I think, look, he didn't create the circumstance, but it has rescued him, because you would have seen a successor government concluded this week. They were that close to agreement, and that's fallen apart now. And their Lapid's mandate, the clock will run out, given where we are. I don't think that's what's motivating Netanyahu right now. I think honestly, what's motivating him is he understands the threshold was crossed, and here he's not pushing the military. The military is probably pushing him, because they thought they had a more sustainable relationship with Yahya Sinwar and the Hamas leader in Gaza, meaning they thought they read him better. They thought he wasn't looking for anything like this. They were saying that that he wasn't looking for an explosion, and they now are rethinking what they feel they have to do. I think they're as much of a normally what you'll see with the military, they're the most prudent in terms of the use of force for obvious reasons, but they're probably also right now thinking about what's the level of pain and destruction we have to inflict on Hamas so that Hamas realizes, okay, we went too far. And that, I think, that's what's driving this right now. Yes, Bibi is going to gain from this politically, not because I think he can put together a government. I don't. When Bennett says he's going to negotiate with them, doesn't produce a government. I said earlier, you need Gideon Sa'ar for that. And his view of Netanyahu, I think, is such that he feels Israel needs a different prime minister for the sake of the well-being of its institutions.
Where do you see Iran's fingerprints in all this? And how would this impact perhaps the Biden administration's toward re-entering the accords?
I don't think it affects the Biden's view on the JCPOA, but I think it does deepen what is a view already. I think the Biden administration is not simply a replay of Obama when it comes to Iran, mostly as it relates to the region. One of the problems with the Obama administration after the JCPOA was done, it really did turn a blind eye to what Iran was doing in the region. There was such fear that this could undo the agreement. Biden would like to put the nuclear issue back in the box because Iran right now, they're enriching to 63%. That means they're like within a couple of days of being able to produce weapons grade material and have a couple of bombs worth of such material. So they want to put it back in the box, but there's a recognition that so much of the trouble in the region comes from the Iranians and that there has to be a counter to that. So I do think there's a tougher mindset in terms of what's required to deal with the Iranians in the region. And, you can argue this both ways. Many in the administration make the argument, if we put this back in the box, we're freer to do more in the region. Others say, when you put it back in the box, you lose all the leverage you have economically, because suddenly they're going to be relieved of a lot of the economic distress and pain they have right now. I can argue it both ways. My own view is that the administration is pretty determined to try to get back in the JCPOA, but the Iranians never make anything easy. And the Iranians right now are holding out and they're trying to raise the pressure on the administration. And I'd like the administration to be saying to them, not just privately, but publicly, you can overplay your hand. We want to resolve this through diplomatic means. You make that impossible, you leave us no choice but to use all the other means to guarantee you won't have a nuclear infrastructure at all.
Do you think Biden has the ability to say that to the Iranians? You think he would, knowing Biden?
I think it's not where the administration is right now, because I think, and by the way, I even accept that, because I think you want to have others with us, but I think we should be saying it privately to them, so that we're conditioning everybody to it. And at a certain point, after you've said it privately long enough, then you can come out publicly. Do I think that at some point Biden would do it? I do. I don't think it's soon, but I think it is at some point. Look, one thing, just again, I'll give you two examples of the administration doing more than we saw before. The Navy interdicted last week one of these dhows that had come from Iran that was filled with weapons for the Houthis. The Navy interdicted it and took the weapons. You didn't hear a whole lot about that before.
No, you didn't.
And also last week, there was provocative behavior by the Iranian small boats in the Straits of Hormuz. One of our ships fired 50 rounds, not just right over the bow. So it was, the message was, okay, you want to go ahead and engage in these kinds of behaviors? We'll answer it. We need to do more of that. There need to be more interdictions. We need to be putting a spotlight on everything they're doing and looking for ways to respond to it. We need to be doing more to help, with the counter drone defenses in Saudi Arabia. We need to be doing more to show we will raise the cost to the Iranians of what they're doing in the region. So that, by the way, the more you do, ironically, there, the more you'll ultimately be more credible on the nuclear issue as well.
What role do you think? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Shows you're prepared to compete.
How much is Iran consulting? How much is Hamas consulting with Iran and Hezbollah right now and coordinating their operations? Is there a chance that missiles could come? What do you think of the likelihood that Hezbollah might enter the fray?
There were 3 rockets that got fired out of Lebanon today into an open area in Israel, but they almost certainly those were Palestinian groups in Lebanon. We've seen that before. Lebanon is in such a failed status, with Hezbollah bearing a lot of the blame. If you look at the speech that Nasrallah gave a week ago Saturday, he was claiming all the great successes. This was the kind of speech you make when you're justifying why you don't have to do anything. And so I think what you're seeing is neither Hezbollah nor the Iranians actually want a war with Israel. So do they like the fact that Israel's tied down right now? Do they like the fact that there's this kind of civil strife within Israel? For sure. By the way, one of the factors I think affecting Hamas, what Mansour Abbas represents is the last thing Hamas wants to see. They don't want to see coexistence between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. They want to create as much potential strife within Israel as possible. So to the extent to which they can try to contribute to that, it's one thing. I don't see at this point Hezbollah looking, to start a war that ends up imposing a terrible price on Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not very popular in Lebanon these days. The last thing they need to do is provoke a war with Israel, where in the end, Israel they will go in on the ground. They will there, because there's 150,000 rockets there. What you're watching right now, where we've had 1,800 rockets hit Israel in the last 4 days. Well, they would be hit by more than 2,000 rockets a day by Hezbollah. They can't live with that. You've shut the whole country down for a month. They won't live with that. They'll go in on the ground, but they'll go after.
They were shut down for 33 days in 2006.
Well, and then the numbers were much less than they would be now.
Right. I've heard some people say that Hezbollah has actually more rockets than NATO. I don't know if that's an exact comparison, but they're pretty heavily armed for a country that's for a group that's not a country.
They have 150,000.
Right. And we're talking about, and they can hit all parts of Israel with these rockets.
Not all 150,000. You're looking about the vast, look, out of 150,000, 2/3 of those are short range.
Like Katusha type?
No, they're bigger than Katyushas, but they
Right.
have these larger rockets that have a range of 70 to 90 kilometers. But then
Are these similar to the rockets that Gaza, similar range, or that
yes,
Hamas has similar? Yeah.
yeah, but they're more sophisticated than the Hamas rockets. The Hamas rockets are still relatively primitive. No, right now, you're talking at probably, you're talking tens of thousands of rockets that could cover all of Israel. They don't yet have terminal guidance, but you're probably in the hundreds. They have hundreds of rockets that do have terminal guidance. For Israel, there's a threshold. They won't let them cross. There's a certain point in which they'll say, we're not letting you get more rockets like that. And so Israel will begin to hit Lebanon. They haven't hit Lebanon because there is a kind of mutual deterrence. It's not just that Nasrallah and Hezbollah is deterred, but so is Israel. Because they understand, Nasrallah established the fact, you hit us, we hit you back. So Israel hits this precision-guided project that Iran runs in Syria. That's why Israel's hit like 1,200 targets there. But they don't do it in Lebanon because they understand that Hezbollah will respond. So there's a kind of mutual deterrence there. But Hezbollah can cross a threshold. When they do, they'll go in, and then you're talking about a very different kind of war.
Let's talk a little bit about domestic reaction. We're in the social media age, and one of the things that people have been calling me about at JCRC is an unprecedented. There's a constant complaint that whenever this is covered, that the media always focuses on the number of wounded, and always purposely puts in the number of children who were killed. And many pro-Israel advocates find that as a way of trying to demonstrate the asymmetry and therefore to blame it. But one thing that I've been hearing a lot more about is social media, and that the amount of anti-Israel tweets and the amount of that is have gone from anti-Israel tweets. Somebody just said Justin, Israel has started ground operations in Gaza, but I have to verify that. Just came from somebody out there. I don't know. I have to verify that. By
the way, there are different kinds of ground operations. Israel can send forces into Gaza and strike in sort of the periphery. It's a big difference between going into the areas close to the border, which are not built up,
right,
and going into built up areas. There are different kinds of,
and using special forces for pinpoint operations,
as opposed to an all-out assault going into Gaza City.
Because I'm looking at the news, I don't see anything right now about that. So I don't think that. I think that's probably more pinpoint, or like you're saying. So, what do you think about the next generation? About this, the next generation of American Jews, I think, are really struggling right now about what's the best thing to do to support Israel. They're seeing, I've seen a couple of American Jewish parents tell me that their kids are engaged in Twitter wars, Jewish parents trying to defend Israel, and the situation has become so complex. What do you think, if anything, American Jews can be doing now to advocate for Israel? I don't know if that's a question you don't want to ask as an answer as an analyst, as okay, if you feel comfortable answering, and I'd love to hear your opinion.
I would just put it this way. First, there's no simple answer, because in social media, the one thing that governs social media is you can make up whatever you want to say, and there's
no rules, right?
But I do think, the focal point pretty much has to be just exposing what Hamas is doing. Look, Hamas wants the focus to be on their dead, not their Hamas dead, but the innocent dead and Jerusalem. That's what they want the focus to be. What needs to be the case is, I like to say, there's a very important data point that needs to be repeated over and over and over again. The whole Daniel Patrick Moynihan line about everybody's entitled to their own opinions, they're just not entitled to their own facts. So Israel got out of Gaza in 2005, 100%. Soldiers, settlements. Now everyone will focus on, oh yeah, but look, they slapped an embargo on Gaza. They withdrew in September of 2005. They were done September 2005 completely. They did not impose the embargo until 2007. In the intervening period, Hamas never stopped. they imposed the embargo only when Hamas carried out the coup and basically threw Fatah out of Gaza. So for more than 18 months, there was no embargo. And there also was no stopping of what Hamas did. So Israel leaves and they get rockets. What other country in the world would subject themselves to being fired upon with rockets from their next door neighbor? Who would do that? What allows Hamas, after Israel gets out, to fire rockets into Israel? Their rockets aren't guided. They don't go after military targets. The contrast with Israel, one of the buildings they bombed, they go to the people in the building in advance, call them and say, get out of the building.
And you know something, Ambassador? We have been, I mean, I'm just saying to you, as somebody who's been involved in the, as somebody who's been working for the JCRC for almost a quarter century, almost 25 years, we constantly make these points over and over. The ones that you make, we make these points out about, and yet there's something about in the American population about asymmetry. I mean, America likes the underdog. America likes to believe in this. And while American, and we know that, the Republican Party, for the most part, remains, according to polls, shows iron wall-to-wall support for Israel. And we know that in the Democratic Party on the left, there has been seepage. And we see that with certain members of Congress being able to hurl that and hurling accusations and using actually some of the language like settler, colonial, state, and apartheid. And this is not coming from the fringe. This is coming, well, it may be coming, but these are elected officials. It used to come from the fringe of activists. This is now something coming into the Democratic Party. And so we're finding that the language that was used among radicals is now being used among mainstream and being justified, and I think is empowering those. And so I guess my question is how, and it's happening all over, not just in the US media. And do you think America's support for Israel overall is waning? Do you think it's eroding? Or do you think it's
Look, I don't. It is a huge mistake for Israel to become a partisan issue, because when it's a partisan issue, then suddenly you're not supporting Israel because Israel is a democracy. You're not supporting Israel because we have shared values and shared interests. You're supporting Israel because your political party supports it. That means if your political party supports it and we're polarized, the other one will not. So one of our obligations is to make sure that Israel remains a nonpartisan issue. And where you see on the progressive side of the Democratic Party what is clearly a decline in support, that means do more with the centrists within the party. It is essential for this to be the case. Some of this is also, it's not just obviously the American Jewish community. There's an obligation on the part of the Israeli government to make the effort to reach out. And that clearly has not been, over the last few years, has not been what it should have been. And there's a consequence. If you see the change here, it's partly because of the polarization here, partly because of the polarization over Trump, partly because of the way that the relationship that Prime Minister Netanyahu had with Trump, that had an effect here. That had an effect on how Israel was seen. So now that you have a different president who, by the way, has a strong emotional commitment to Israel. Biden is a guy who went to Israel when he was 29-year-old senator. His identity, his identification with Israel, support for Israel is instinctive for him. And so, look, the administration so far blocked the Security Council resolution condemning Israel right now. And it is already talking about if Israel needs more Iron Dome rockets or needs another supply line, it will provide them. Has said what Hamas is doing is completely wrong and Israel has the right of self-defense. I mean, it's important that at the political level that keeps being repeated as well. I talk about the data points because I think there is this image of, look at the impoverished conditions within Gaza. Yeah, isn't it interesting that whatever money goes into Gaza, how much does Hamas divert for its military purposes? And
how would you make your Marshall Plan work if one of the questions hit on is that if one of the questions, we've got some excellent questions, and really we could do this for 2 hours. There are your Marshall Plan for Gaza. Would Hamas be given the money? No. Or how would it be? Because they said, how can you, if they can't even trust them to manage their own economy, how can you trust them to administer billions of dollars worth of funds?
You've created an international mechanism that is responsible for providing the aid and for creating the contracts for producing what's going to happen on the ground. Hamas doesn't enter into it. And they're going to block it. They're going to deny the public there this because they want to run it. They've demonstrated how well they run things. The truth is, they offered to Abu Mazen to have the PA come back in and assume responsibility for Gaza. Only one catch: they weren't going to give up their weapons.
It's a slight problem.
Well, so what they wanted was, we don't want to be stuck with governance because we can't do it. You be stuck with the governance, but we hold the gun over your head, literally.
What's going to be the PA-Hamas relationship when this is over?
Ron, there have been, by my count, 11 reconciliation agreements reached between Fatah and Hamas.
In how many years is that?
Basically since the split, 2007 to 2021. So 14 years, 11 reconciliation agreements reached, touted, celebrated, none materialized.
You'll apologize if I'm laughing a little bit at that statistic. Interesting question. Why is you have gone ahead when you started your talk, Ambassador? You talked about almost the perfect storm of events that could happen, and the question is, Israel, okay, from Haaretz, Israel's military said it has begun ground and air operations against Hamas. That's from Haaretz.
Ground operations, as I said, it means you send some people in there. It doesn't,
it doesn't mean 5,000 people, right?
Yeah. But again, I view it, sometimes you use force to send a political signal. If Hamas, some of this I suspect is if Hamas thinks Israel really won't come in on the ground, then you actually have to do some ground incursions to show don't count on it.
Right. So again, it's very interesting. If you're a young Israeli Arab who's not radicalized, but you have been living in what you thought was in a coexistent atmosphere, and you are troubled by what you saw in Jerusalem, and you see what's happening in conflict, what are your hopes and beliefs? I know you said you think there's going to be it requires strong leadership, but we've got a whole generation of young minds who are conditioning their future political conditions based on their youthful experiences. And so I guess, I find one of the things that we've received a lot of questions about is about the social fabric of Israel. What role, is there an international role to help Israel in building its internal cohesion?
I don't think so. I mean, this is something Israelis are going to have to take on. This is a kind of classic example where they have the responsibility to repair the social fabric. It's been torn. They can see that. They can see what the consequences are. This is a startup nation. The startup nation has to heal itself, and it requires political leadership that reaches out. It requires political leadership to set a tone, to establish the values. Look, the strongest, best statements I heard, not surprisingly, were from President Rivlin.
Why were they the best?
Because they were looking at everybody as having a shared responsibility. They were looking at everybody as looking at the legacy and the history of what this state represents. They had an emotional content. They were appealing at a level of deep respect. They were the best because of that.
One last question, Ambassador. We've talked a lot about the conflict. We've talked a lot about the situation. Give us some reason for optimism, if there is.
Well, Ron, when you come to me when things are really bleak and ask me to come up with something that looks good, look, I will say this. I said it before. I won't say optimistic, but hopeful. Israel has always met every challenge that it faced that was acute and required a kind of understanding of how important the challenge was. And I still think Israel is up to that. And I still believe what the normalization process can be used in time, not immediately, to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. what we have been reminded of is that you couldn't wish the Palestinian problem away. And those who thought you could put it in the icebox and forget about it and the Arabs will take their place, well, you can't. And you see that it also rebounds ultimately within Israel itself, which is a reminder of why you can't ignore it. And there needs to be some soul searching. It will be easy to fall back into the habit of, trying just to go back to the status quo ante. But I think the real wake-up call is what's happened within Israel. That's the profound threat. I said it before, the profound threat to Israel, what's happening within Israel, it's not Hamas. Hamas is not a profound threat to Israel.
It makes you wonder if the thing that will be that Israel will most remember when this conflict is over is what it happened in Israel itself, and if that may in and of itself be more of a would the loss of social fabric and coexistence in Israel, whether that might help push the peace accords forward. Because if Israel views it as, not Israel may have a different perspective. Israel may have obviously difficulty, like even negotiating for years over the West Bank, the territories, and everything else. But I'm wondering if this just might give Israel the impetus, or may make the population more willing to say, look, coming to a compromise with the Palestinians is not something we wanted to do out of historical or reasons, but we need to do it for our own internal pre-67 Israel.
It's hard to know. I do think the most immediate effect, I think, will be a recognition that there's a profound problem within the state that they have to address. That, I think, will be item number one. After that, then you can think about how you try to build a normalization process and fold Arab outreach to Israel into certain steps Israel could take towards Palestinians.
Ambassador, thank you so much. We're always thrilled that you make yourself available to our JCRC and to the Jewish community across the country to provide us with the analysis and that we crave during the situation, help us put the conflict in a setup in perspective. And thank you once again for making yourself available. We deeply appreciate all you've done for our country and for the Jewish community. I'd like to thank the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington for partnering with us. A recording of today's webinar will be posted on our social media and website. Please visit jcouncil.org and sign up for our newsletter and find more resources and information on this current situation in Israel. We pray for peace in Israel and the region and hope for a de-escalation. I wish all of our Muslims friends an Eid Mubarak and all of you a good end to your week and an early Chag Shavuot Sameach. Thank you.
Thank you.